Need for forgiveness. We've all struggled at one point in our lives with feelings of feeling guilty. Now, some of those feelings are justified, sometimes they're not. Today, we're going to continue looking at existential reasons for belief in God. Again, we're going to be looking at this book as one of our main sources. I will also include some links in the video description to help facilitate some further study. And I would encourage you to definitely look into this a little more. Existential reasons for belief in God has helped me as someone who kind of comes from a more of a, I guess, Pentecostal background. It's a lot of emotions and kind of go into that. And as we sometimes start checking out different things, we start to get a kind of a negative feeling, for lack of a better word, when it comes to the emotions. So, without further ado, let me go ahead and drop the intro and we'll dive right in. This is the Vega Pod, inviting you to look at the issues through a biblical lens. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we're going to be looking at existential reasons for belief in God. Today, we're going to be looking at guilt and the need for forgiveness. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. And let me go ahead and scroll up here and let me hide this logo. It makes it a little easier to see some of the other slides. God, guilt, forgiveness. All right. Let's see. Absolution of guilt. We sense, independently of biblical truths, that something is wrong with ourselves, and we want to know how it can be made right. We need to know that we are forgiven for going astray. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis. And in the Worldview Bulletin article, they'll give you the source of where they got this quote. I have talked to some who felt guilt when they jolly well ought to have felt it. They have behaved like brutes and know it. I've also met others who felt guilty and weren't guilty by any standard I can apply. And thirdly, I've met people who were guilty and didn't seem to feel guilt. And isn't this what we should expect? People can be malades imaginaires, hypochondriacs, who are well and think they are ill, and others, especially consumptives, those with a destructive disease, are ill and think they are well. And thirdly, far the largest class, people are ill and know they are ill. I like this quote here because it highlights that we know something is wrong, right? As it says in the first bullet point, we know that something is wrong. And we want, in a sense, we want to do something about it, right? So we're not kind of trying to hide it or deny it. At least I would say a large majority of people. I guess I can't say most. Some people are seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron, 1 Timothy 4:2. For this and other reasons, the conscience may not always serve as a reliable guide. In our human relations, we recognize the need of forgiveness from one another when we have hurt or broken trust with others. Even when we have harmed persons and damaged relationships, ultimately, our wrong is against the divine lawgiver. So, yeah, there's this idea of this sense where we sin against other people, but ultimately, our sin is against the divine lawgiver, God, right? Jesus. We Christians know that the heavy burden of guilt is alleviated by grace of the divine lawgiver, the just and the justifier, Romans 3, verse 26. When we realize we have looked for meaning in places that cannot be found or in places that give only a transient or vacuous sense of meaning, we want to know that we are still loved. The second bullet point is emphasizing how when we realize that we look for meaning in temporary things, right? Things that aren't really going to fill us, we want to look past that. We want to look at something transcendent. That's where kind of God comes in and satisfies this existential need, right, that we have. Our own guilt, along with the need for forgiveness, is one of those deep human longings that we have. When one possesses the disposition to accept forgiveness, one is more open to allowing oneself to be loved. And this promotes more meaningful connections with others because it eliminates a barrier to those connections. So, if we become convinced that loving, forgiving, and allowing ourselves to be forgiven have more value than hating, bitterness, and unwillingness to let ourselves be forgiven, or than simple indifference, then we are likely to want them. He's emphasizing this desire, this need that we have for forgiveness. Third, faith in the Christian God satisfies at least some of the existential needs better than does the faith or other supreme state in non-Christian religions. such as the Buddhist emptiness, because the faith in non Christian religions does not deal with all of the existential needs, such as the need for forgiveness or for life after death in a state free of this life's troubles. And these last three quotes I pulled from the Existential Reasons for Belief in God. I would strongly recommend looking through the book. I don't think there's an ebook available, but I think the paperback is maybe about $15, maybe 20. I got mine on Amazon. And we're gonna look at a couple verses here emphasizing this idea of forgiveness, and the next slide we'll look at some verses dealing with guilt. Now, the first of the verses are gonna kind of be dealing with how we should forgive others, and the last two verses kind of deal with kind of our need for forgiveness, right? So I always want to point back to the scriptures because I think it's important that, you know, the tagline for the channel is, and inviting you to look at the issues through a biblical lens. So I want to make sure that we emphasize and highlight that in the videos. Bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. Colossians 3:13. So the idea here is very simple, right? God forgave us, therefore we should forgive. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. Ephesians 4:32. To the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him. Daniel 9, verse 9, ESV. The point here is how we, going back to one of the other bullet points said, is how when we sin, ultimately we are sinning against the divine lawgiver, and how we need forgiveness from God, right? We not only need forgiveness, from other people, but we need forgiveness ultimately from the creator of all life, the source of all life, Jesus Christ. So if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Matthew 5:23-24 ESV. The point here is, there's needing forgiveness from the party that you offended, right? Needing forgiveness from other people. For whoever keeps the whole law, but falls in one point has become guilty of all of it. This is not good news for us, right? Whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. Now, for us that are in Jesus Christ, he fulfills the law. But if you try to live by the law, then you break one, you're guilty of all of it. So in a sense, we already know this as believers. We are guilty before God. And we want to, it's just this need to, I said in the first bullet point, to this absolution of guilt, like this removal of guilt. So the point here is whether we look to, right? It's an existential need that we have. Ultimately, Jesus is the only one who can remove this guilt that we have. Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with water, washed with pure water. Hebrews 10, verse 22. I acknowledge my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Psalm 32, verse 5. So here's David speaking here, and he's saying, oh, hey, listen, I sinned, and I realized that my sin was ultimately against you. I confessed my sin, and now I experienced that forgiveness that only you can give. So we have this. This is kind of where we see both of them emphasized, right? This guilt that he has, this need for forgiveness, and this need for the removal of this guilt. And he knows that it can only come from God. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Isaiah 6, verse 7. This is that famous picture of Isaiah and the burning coal when the angel touches, or the cherubim, or the cherub, I guess, touches his lips, right? So here we are, we looked at a few verses here, and I appreciate you guys. And without further ado,